Okay.
Hi, hey, hello
Hey.
again.
Hey, calling Chris Anderson once again in a
On the road.
hotel room.
Yeah, once again in a hotel room.
Maybe you're at home and this is a virtual background you put
Virtual
to
hotel room
impress us
background.
all.
That's
And
right.
you got a virtual tie on too.
I do. I do.
You're really just in shorts and a t-shirt.
Floppy slippers.
There you go.
No, I'm in Berlin. I'm in Berlin. Finishing up the VE Day site inspection. So seeing lots of good stuff and taking a break to talk to my good friend Rick Beyer in Chicago.
Chicago.
But I
Nothing
heard
changes
you're
here.
only temporarily in Chicago, or you're just only
I was
recently
in
back from Chicago.
Philadelphia
Yeah.
this morning when I woke up at 3:30 a.m. Eastern time, and
Yet
I'm
you're
sure
still chipper.
some of my friends in the Philadelphia area, like Doug McCord, go, Rick, why didn't you call me? I was like, believe me, there was no time. There was no time. I was there for the 100th birthday party for a Ghost Army veteran, John
Nice.
Christman. Yeah, so that was fun. Hey, welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show and for sending Chris on the road and occasionally me. I think they're sending me on the road soon. Check out their rich offerings of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com. Chris, it is Groundhog Day.
Is it?
It is.
And
And so in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, Puxatawny Phil, the
yeah,
prognosticator of prognosticators,
yeah.
says that it's going to be 6 more weeks of winter.
Okay.
But here in Illinois, in Woodstock, Illinois, where they filmed the movie Groundhog Day,
Yeah.
now they've got Woodstock Willie,
So
their
it's
own
like battling
groundhog.
groundhogs,
And Woodstock Willie says there's going to be an early spring.
but but I thought you have to trust the original one, isn't it?
I think that there's a messaging inconsistency here in the Groundhog Network that they need to work out.
I understand.
But you can pick your answer and it's whatever you want
Well,
to
as
pick.
we say, do tell when you get the results.
I sure will. In the meantime, I just want to say to everybody who's out there, let us know what you're drinking, whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast. We are glad you're here, and today we're going to be talking about one day in World War II. But before we do that, we should thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, Chris.
Absolutely.
Especially our top shelf patrons listed here. I have to update this list. I have to go through and make sure that everybody's really paying. So if you're sliding along here and you think, oh, it's been a while, yeah, check that out, because otherwise you get right off the.
But then we have all that space at the bottom to fill up.
Yeah, I don't think there's too many people who have left us there. But you can join us, by the way, by going to patreon.com/historyhappyhour. All right. So, Chris, is there anybody out there, or am I just chatting with you?
There are quite a few. Ted is joining us from Northern Virginia, Ann Bryan from Little Rock, Gene Templin from a cold and snowy PA.
No, it was.
And he says he missed you in Pennsylvania as well, so that somebody else.
I'm sorry.
And Xavier is calling from Barcelona.
Xavier's there in Barcelona.
So we are international again.
Fantastic. All right. Well, give me a cue and let's get this puppy underway.
It's official.
The bar is open.
The bar is open.
Hey, today we're going to talk about one day in World War II, because that's what Rona Simmons has written about in her new book, which is called No Average Day. And the day she picked to write about was October 24th, 1944, when more than 2,600 Americans perished. That's more than any other day of the war. And she tells the stories of people who died that day around the globe. Rona is an award-winning author of historical fiction and nonfiction. For the last several years, she has focused on untold and often overlooked stories from World War II, including her book, The Other Veterans of World War II, Stories from Behind the Front Lines. So we want to say, Rona, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Welcome.
Good evening. Thank you very much.
It's our pleasure to have you here. Did you conform with the tradition and bring a cocktail?
I have a bourbon I'm going to call Loose Lips, because we're going to talk about sinking ships.
Okay. What are they serving up in Berlin, Mr. Anderson?
Well, it's a gin and tonic, but the hotel room doesn't have lemons or limes, so it's a very, plain.
Can we
looking
get
one,
can
but-
we get some kind of a chemical test to prove that you're not just
All
I'm
right, so Rick,
drinking.
how long have you known me?
Okay, yeah.
I the odds are that it's gin and
Rona, let me start out.
whoa. And you?
So yes, I've got
All right,
my,
thank you.
I've
Just
got
checking.
my, I'm drinking actually a beer that's called a hop hazard.
Okay.
So the hazard may be, what it does to me, and when I start hopping, you'll know that
Oh, okay.
I've been
Now
hazarded.
you may ask your question.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Rona, very simple starting question. We were joking about this. You said, well, I won't have to talk about my background. But look, you're not, I guess, a historian per se. No offense. I mean, I'm not either, technically, although I have kind of become one. But you've got a background as a novelist, as a short story writer. So what drew you to writing nonfiction about World War II?
Well, no, you're right. I don't consider myself a historian. I studied boring economics, career in business and economics. And when I retired, because of my father, probably more so than anything, who was a World War II fighter pilot in World War II, and I have military throughout my family. Grandfathers that fought in World War I, my father in World War II, a husband who was in the Vietnam era, nephew who is in Iraq. So it's in my heart and soul, I guess I should say. And so I was drawn to that period. And I always liked history, but I couldn't figure out in college what I would ever do with a degree in history. So I chose business. But roundabout, I started out with some fiction, mostly historical fiction, and then somehow tripped on meeting a number of veterans that just sent me down this path. I wanted to make sure that their stories were not forgotten.
So, Rona, why October 24th?
Well,
1944?
it came about by accident, absolutely. And of course, it's now I look back and everyone asks that question, and I'm thinking, what ended up triggering forgotten? So
You can make up a different version each time you tell the story.
no, it's pretty much the same.
Right.
I had been volunteering with a group where we're writing different profiles of fallen soldiers in the United States. And in doing that, of course, you research, try to find out who they were, where they came from, what their background was. And I found one story, and then I kept finding another one, and the date, October 24th, kept coming up. And I thought, well, that's an odd day for, and I didn't know what had happened on that day. So when I kept coming across that date, I decided to look into it. And then because I'm a sort of obsessive compulsive, I started counting, and I kept filling in the tick boxes. And then I said, there's something going on here. And then, of course, I found the story of the Arasan Maru, which is for it to be the single deadliest day of the war for the United States, you had to find something that was a ship sinking, where hundreds, thousands of people were lost in that one day. No battle. Even people say, oh, well, it must, if you ask someone what they think the single deadliest day is, they'll often say Pearl Harbor or D-Day. Those are very close, but they actually were not. October 24th has them beat by, in one case, 30 or 40 people. But so you had to find a sinking of a ship and not Battle of the Bulge. Okinawa went on for days, weeks, months. Doesn't count, even though there were more soldiers that would have fallen on those days. So when I found that date and I realized that no one spoke of it, no one really knows. People have heard about the hell ships. They may be aware of them, but they aren't aware of this particular disaster.
Well, look, I wanted to ask you this. So, what people in our audience know about, because I've talked about it a little bit, is that I pitched an idea for a similar book some years ago, which was not about the people who died necessarily, but it was about one day in World War II and trying to tell that story all across the globe, which your book does. I didn't get very far. No worries. You didn't take it away from me. But I picked September 15th, 1944, because first of all, it happens in the fall of 44, which is a time when there's stuff going on all over the world. and secondly, because it was the date of the invasion of Peleliu. So it gave me a big battle to kind of anchor the idea for the book on. So you don't have a big battle. And as you started out, was that something that gave you a pause, or did you like consider it an opportunity to fulfill?
Yeah, I think what intrigued me was, again, as you said, picking a date later in the war when I decided to tell the story of the war through a day. I really, at the time I started, it didn't have to be the deadliest day. It just turned out that I picked that particular day. But what I wanted to do, because you have all the books written on World War II, they cover segments of the war for the most part, unless it's a history text. And I wanted to make sure that people understood the global nature of it, people who don't necessarily read deep into history. But they might read about Normandy, they might read about Pearl Harbor, but they rarely put that in the context of what was happening around the globe. So I knew I was going to do it anyway, but I picked it later in the war, as you say, because so much was going on. I also didn't want it to be about just the Pacific or just one branch of the service. I wanted to make sure there was enough to go to the major branches of the military service. And then what it morphed into, I thought, well, what if I could find the time of day that these soldiers died, and then tell it chronologically. And because I had already known that I had several of the fallen in their biographies, and I knew what battle they were in or the time of death in many cases, not all. And so that's when I started putting it into chronological order. And the warning I'll give you if you choose to do something like this, I didn't realize it at the time, and I might have changed my mind had I not already gotten halfway down before I realized it. Every chapter, and I set it out to be 24 chapters, 24 hours a day, October 24th, 1944. And when I realized that meant each chapter was going to be a different battle, I might go from 3 a.m. in the Pacific to 4 a.m. in Europe to 5 a.m. in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So it ended up, I wrote the story of all the services across the globe, different battles. So each chapter was an enormous amount of research, just to be able to describe the background in a nutshell of what was going on.
Oh, I bet.
It was a daunting task, one I didn't realize, but I'm delighted that I did it and stuck with it.
So, Rona, before we dive into maybe some individual cases, why don't you tell us what is going on in October of 1944? What's the state of the war? What's the world like? Kind of set the scene for us.
Sure. I think the number is the 1362nd day of the war. So we're well into the war. Pearl Harbor, obviously Normandy is behind us. A lot of the troops are moving. They've already moved from North Africa, if we're talking about Europe, into Southern Europe. They're beginning that push north, or really pretty far up the French countryside, moving into the Alps, pushing the Germans back in Europe. In the Pacific, where MacArthur is coming toward, going back to fulfill his promise to liberate the Philippines. So he's on the way. The landings in the Philippines take place on the 20th. So there is the Japanese have invaded, and then they're in full, I'll say maybe they didn't realize it, panic mode at the time, but recognizing that, yes, in fact, the Americans have come. They're not only coming, they are here. So you have a number of the naval activities across the Philippines, from New Guinea all the way up to not quite to the Japanese home islands at that time. There's on both coasts, or both halves of the perspective, there's a lot going on. The thing that is missing to a lot of people is what was going on in the United States, because we tend to forget that people died here too. People who I like to give as much credit, not just to those who were in the battle, but those who had committed, who may have even been on their, come home and going back, were in training and about to leave the United States to go to war, and were killed. So I wanted to take that perspective and put that in too. So I wasn't ignoring the United States and what was happening here, even though a lot of people think, well, nothing happened. In fact, there were quite a lot of deaths, and that made it out. So that's the broad landscape.
So here's you sent this over. This is a map, and I don't. We'll leave the pictures aside for the moment, but this is a map of where each chapter essentially takes place. Each of the you focus primarily on one person in most of those chapters, sometimes on more than one, I think that it is quite striking that it really is all over the globe. But my question here, as we look at this, is you've decided to do the book. You've picked October 24th as the day, but how do you go about selecting from the 2,600 people who died the ones you're going to profile? And maybe I should save the second question to later because I don't want to keep you going here for the whole show. But how do you then research those people? I mean, that just seems, of course, they're dead, so they can't tell their story. So that's an added layer of difficulty.
Right. Well, once I had established the different battles and I knew where things were happening, I might pick a ship. And I created a database of all databases, or the mother of all databases, whatever you want to say. So I had my 2,600 names. I knew who had died, and by name, and where I had the battles or ships they were on. And so I began looking for what I considered interesting things, and I tried not to repeat. Even though some places were fairly difficult to push in from North Africa to Italy and to France, there were a lot of the units going that direction. So I might pick one that was further along and closer to the border with Germany, and then one that was still moving up into France. I picked different ships that were in different locations, different types of ships. So trying to make sure I covered, as I said, all branches of the military, as well as people who didn't die in combat. As I mentioned before, disease took a number of lives. So sometimes, to make the stories different, I would focus on a soldier who died of a disease, who had a heart attack, or who fell ill, automobile accidents, motorcycle accidents, people who were shot down, people who were on the ground. So if I would do one story of a sailor who drowned, and actually one had drowned when he went to the beach to swim, and another one who died in the sinking of the ship. Then I would try to move on to a different type of story and try not to repeat. And a couple of times I found some that were similar, and so I might push them off to the side and pick the more interesting aspects, or where I could find enough detail. So how you do it, luckily, we're very, very fortunate today with the research tools that are out there. As I mentioned, I work with this other group on a volunteer basis, and we have access to a lot of the National Archives, all of the military units where they write stories about their own battles, their own experiences. Perhaps the best source, or the more accurate source, because I was trying to be very diligent about, and when I decided to put these in order, ship's logs are just wonderful, because in the midst of battle, there's somebody on that ship that's saying at 3:35 a.m. the torpedoes were launched for the first volley, and then at 3:46. And so you knew when the ship was hit or what kind of damage and when they found people. So the ships were easy in that respect to find the time of the battle. And they reported at the end of the day who was lost and for what reason, or how they were lost and what happened. The battles on the ground, of course, were much more difficult, and that no one was making records while they're trying to fire their weapons and defend themselves. So sometimes those I could only put within a range. I knew the battle started at 8 a.m. and went to noon or midnight or something. So I had to, use some judgment in there as to where best to slot someone. But you got a fairly good idea to do that. But the sources are innumerable between findagrave.com, Ancestry Institution, and again, any military unit, especially the Facebook groups now that are populated with people who are trying to preserve their memories, and they've given their diaries and their journals, whatever.
Yeah. So, well, let's start with a few examples of what you've been talking about, because you obviously you find out quite a bit about some of these people, right?
Right.
I hate to kind of be predictable, but let's start with the first and see where that takes us.
Okay. If you want to flip back to that map of somebody, let's see. Actually, going to, thank you, Chris. Start with the color picture there on the top right, or on the top of the column on the right. He's not the first. In fact, he died at 10:30. Gervis Haltom, who was in the Marines. And the reason I told his story, the person pictured there is Peter Renfrens. And he was searching for his uncle, who was a sergeant in the Army Air Force and who disappeared on a flight. And he went to the South Pacific looking for any information that he could find on his father. On his uncle. And that his uncle died on Yap Island, which, you'd think tiny island out in the middle of the Pacific, he would not have too much trouble finding him, but he didn't. And instead he found Gervis Haltom's gravesite. And the interesting thing was Gervis was in the Marines and he was a pilot, and he was flying missions from Peleliu to Yap Island. We were convinced that the air base, the Japanese air and naval bases there, would be a threat to us as we came across to the Philippines. And so MacArthur wanted that island taken and take the base for our own use. And so Gervis was sent on a mission over there to check the base, which had been bombed day after day after day, this tiny little island with a very small indigenous population. And they went through strafing with fighters as well as bombers. And Gervis Haltom was flying. They flew in, they looked at the ground, they said that we can report back that this island is not going to be of any use to us. Well, they said, okay, but fine, let's make a strafing run through there. And they made the run, and his plane was shot down. But the interesting thing, what Peter Renfrens found when he went to Yap Island, is the indigenous population took him to see Gervis Haltom's grave, where it had been. In fact, in 1948, I think his remains were returned, but they still tended to his grave. And kept,
you said they put flowers there every
yes, and so
week or something.
Yeah, remembering this and kept the jungle from encroaching on his gravesite. And when I heard that, I said, okay, that's in the book. Let's go on from here. So that was the one when I finally found, if you're digging, I actually talked to Peter Renfrens. And so I thought, well, maybe I can make connections with other people that will help flesh out these stories. And that's what happened. Okay. The first one is really from the map is Paul Miller. And he, at the very top, he was a prisoner of war and died in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in the Japanese home islands. It was an interesting story too, and all of the people pictured here, I was able to connect with their relatives or descendants who helped me flesh out the story. Well, Paul had an interesting background. He came from a family of very devout Christians, a very specific sect, and he began dating a young lady who was not from the church. So his mother was did not approve of that. And she decided, and this was 1940, maybe a stint in the army would be good for you. So she pressured him to join the army, even though they weren't, they were probably more favor of maintaining peace, but we were still neutral at that point. So I thought, what could happen, right? So she convinces him to go into the army. He enlists. He gets sent to the Philippines, but it's a wonderful job. He becomes he's a clerk in our finance office in the Philippines. And it's a lovely place, a plum job. There are candlelight dinners for the brass, not for Paul. He was a young enlisted man, but he could play golf on the golf course. They had theaters. It was lovely until, of course, Clark Field was bombed. And things changed immediately. And the finance office was actually, when they withdrew to Corregidor, they were in charge of burning documents, cutting up pesos, so that all this couldn't be captured by the Japanese. Well, of course, he was taken prisoner, went through the Bataan Death March, and then was sent on possibly a hell ship. We don't exactly know, but he ended up, and the dates coincide with one of the early hell ships when the Japanese decided they needed to vacate the prisons and bring some of the slave labor back to the Japanese home islands. He was sent. His ship was actually attacked. It did not sink, and the torpedoes missed, and he ended up in the death camps or the slave labor camps. It was the Mitsubishi mining camp, mining copper, which was just a horrific. They existed and did this hard labor with a cup of rice and a bowl of or a cup of soup a day. Terrible conditions, beatings, etc. And he died of very, very malnutrition while he was in the camp. Now, because we only know that he was there, we don't know the time of day he died. I decided this was the one case where I would decree him number one, and I made the hour 3 a.m. because I said I want him not to have to go to the mine today. So I put his death, and I tell this in the book, so I didn't want to mislead anybody. We don't know, but we know he died on that day from records after the fact, after the end of the war. So go ahead.
Yeah, so we can come back to some individual stories, but one of the things that I often tell people on tours is that our narratives about war would be very different if they were told by the people who died instead of the people who survived. And you haven't done that, but you've kind of done that. Focusing, I mean, at virtually every one of your chapters, there's somebody who we meet who is going to pass away on October 24th. And do you feel that, I mean, did this give you a different perspective on the war than you usually get? Did you start to kind of feel the weight of those deaths as you went through writing the book?
That's funny. That's a question. A lot of people say, how could you continue, this chapter after chapter? Find a person, he's going to die. But I think it was actually almost the opposite. It really made me keep going because like the earlier book you mentioned, the stories from behind the front lines, I chose people who never fired a gun, who were not in any of the battles, but they had remarkable stories. And oftentimes when I interviewed them, because they were living and they had survived, they would say, well, I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything. So I was just a medic, or I was just this, or I just carried the cargo ashore. And my own father was a fighter pilot. And I talked to him and I said that he lived to be 97. And I said, what did you do? He said, oh, I didn't do anything. I said, I'm sorry, you're a fighter pilot. You're shooting at people. People are shooting at you. And you say you don't do anything. And that's a common phrase among those who lived. But I think what outweighed the sort of dreariness of it is to bring these people, back to life, make sure their story is told and not forgotten, and to really celebrate that and celebrate their memory. So to me, each one was, instead of a name on a tombstone or in a document somewhere in some archive, let's make this person flesh and blood and breathing again, and let him tell his story as he can through artifacts and wonderfully when I found the families of these people, who some of whom had no idea what happened. They might have a piece of paper or a letter from the government that said your son passed away, or a little card from the Red Cross that survived that said, I'm fine. I'm a prisoner of war, or I'm in camp number 26 and my health is excellent. Of course, it wasn't, but that's all they had. And so it was great to help them find out something more about their uncle or grandfather or something.
Okay, Rona, we have a question here from Wally Morrison, and you might want to answer and elaborate. Wally wants to know, is there a government source that tracked daily deaths during the war?
Boy, don't I wish there were.
Yeah, I bet.
It would have saved me countless hours. And the quick answer is no. There's almost nothing by hour or even by day. You really have to go to a unit. Like I said, the ships are marvelous. Ships are as close as you can come to that. But even then, you have to go to each ship. There's no compilation. If there are 10 ships in this battle, it doesn't matter. You're going to have to go individually to each one. There are now searchable databases that didn't used to exist. You can go on things like findagrave.com and say, give me everyone who died on this day. Actually, the American Battle Monuments Commission does the same thing. And you can like search Arlington or search any of our national, whether they be here or internationally, grave sites, and they often do queries. They never were designed for that purpose, so sometimes it's a little clunky, and you in case like Find a Grave, you don't know whether you really got everybody or not. The battle monuments, official government ones, are more reliable, but their search engines aren't quite that sophisticated.
So you anchor this book with the sinking of the Japanese prison ship, or hell ship, as you call it, the Arasan Maru, which killed 1,800 of the American soldiers who died that day. And you sent along this graphic to help kind of get in your mind what 1,800 is, that each of these people here represents 10 people who are on that ship who died. And look, that's way more people than were killed on Omaha Beach, for example. But I don't think anybody knows anything about this ship. I certainly hadn't known anything about it. Can you talk a little bit about it and how we know about it? And then, in this case, also maybe talk a little bit about the survivors from that.
And on this slide, if anyone sees a little green man in the bottom, that represents the 9 survivors of the Arasan Maru. There were 1,800 people, and if you look quickly at the map, and then we can dispense with that, but the ship left Manila. These were prisoners who were emptied from Camp O'Donnell, Camp Cabanatuan, put in the holds. This was happening they left Manila on October 12th. This was as we knew the Americans were coming in and threatening to land and deprive the Japanese of having these groups of slave labor, the thousands that were in the Philippines, as they were in other areas around the South Pacific. They left Manila on the 12th. They took cover on the coast of Palawan Island because they were trying to escape being detected by the Americans in some bombing runs we were making. They, in fact, were discovered down there, but they were not hit. And then they went back to Manila on the 20th and stayed there a day to join with a convoy and wait for the convoy to assemble. And then on the 21st, they headed north towards the Japanese home island of Formosa, Taiwan, where they were going to be unloaded for prisoner of war camps and slave labor camps. And on the 24th is when the ship was sunk. And so we don't really need the map, but so at that point, the Arasan Maru was the worst in terms of total numbers who died, and I think probably the worst of any in terms of numbers on ship. When they took the prisoners in all of the hell ships that they did this for, they would take groups of prisoners and just pack them into the holds, hundreds of them. And there was, for most of them, I won't say all, but Arasan Maru, there was no place to sit. There was maybe a few bunks on the sides of the ship against the holds. They would be packed into those, maybe 5 or 6 people in one little bunk. They had to stand, or in the case of some who died, they were left at the feet, if they could even collapse, of the feet of the others. There were 5 5-gallon buckets at the front of the hold for latrines. Now, 1,800 people were in one hold. At most, it could have held 500, not even comfortably. If you were at the back of the hold, you are not making it to those 5-gallon buckets. Forget it. You're getting 1 cup of water, a bit of rice a day. The temperature is over 100 degrees. And they say that if you were so unfortunate to be against the sides of the hole, if you touched it, because of the temperatures, you would burn yourself. So just absolutely horrible conditions. To my knowledge, on the Arasan Maru, there was no one who was killed at the hands of their own fellow soldiers. That did happen on other ships. People just went mad, desperate, and killed people. And that, to my knowledge, didn't happen. But they were kept in those holds the entire trip. Now, there were, I think, a dozen men who would go up on the deck to fix dinner, meaning pour hot water into, with a little gruel in it, and then pass it down into the holds. The holds were shut. So they're in the dark on top of everything else. I mean, there are conditions that you can't even fathom. And this went on, as I say, for 11, in the case of the Arasan Maru, from October 12th through October 23rd, 24th. So for 12 days, this goes on, unending. And the prisoners, it's noted on most of them, they would hear the bombers come over, or planes, and they would shout, let your bombs go, kill us. They were ready to go. They wanted to be freed from it. They had hoped to be bombed and have the ship break apart. It didn't. They were strafed a couple of times, but they were on the Arasan Maru. They were not hit, and so the voyage continued. They got on the 24th. They were struck by an American submarine, and the submarine saw the ships in the convoy, picked out the Arasan Maru, which looks like any other cargo freighter, passenger freighter. There were no markings to say that there were prisoners on board. The Japanese did not do that, and so it was fair game. And they figured they'd sunk a cargo ship, and so the ship broke apart about 5:30 in the afternoon, and many of the men couldn't swim. And so on the one bright note, they went into the kitchens and ate and drank whatever they could, water, food. They stuffed themselves. They were so hungry. And then they went down with the ship. Some of them, men, because it was a convoy, there were other Japanese ships in the area. And they started swimming towards the other Japanese ships. And those Japanese crew fired on the prisoners that were swimming towards them, beat them away with these long poles, and did everything. They were not going to pick up a single passenger, and they didn't. So then everyone, of course, was scrambling. A few people had life jackets. And what they didn't know, and I didn't know, a K-POC life jacket doesn't last. It will fill up over time with water and get soaking wet, so it won't hold you up, but it did allow some time. People found bits of debris or boards to hang on to. And as I said, there were 9 survivors. And the convoy left after a while and left these men in the water, in the dark, in the cold. And 5 men, one gentleman found a lifeboat passing by and grabbed onto it and jumped in. And soon 4 other people found him. And so those 5 men survived. One of them had some idea of navigation, and he helped sail them towards China to kind of figure out where they were. And they just headed in that direction. They had luckily a sail.
Wow.
Actually, a box came floating by them, and they picked it up, and it had a sail. And so they attached it. Now, why this is not a Hollywood movie, I have no idea, because there's no better story. And they sail, and they got picked up by a Chinese, I'll say a fishing boat, just shy of the Chinese coast. China, we have to remind people, was our ally at the time. And so they helped them make their way back to our outposts in China and India, and then from there they came back to the U.S. The other 4 were picked up later by Japanese ships, not together. 2 of them were together, and the other 2 were happenstance. They ended up going back onto a boat and ended up in the Japanese prison camps. One of them died there, and 2, I think, were liberated at the end of the war. But the 5 who made it back, it's an interesting story. They were given medals. They got back to the United States in December 44. 2 months after they had been sunk, and met in the White House and with the military, and were told not to speak of it. The last thing the United States wanted at that point, when things looked like maybe things were turning into our favor, is to hear about this. because these held ships and what happened on them hadn't become public knowledge yet. And for these men to say that 1,800 people, Americans, perished would have been unthinkable and demoralizing. So they didn't talk. But over time, the story leaked out, and people who found out who they were and what ship they were on, finally, the story came out. And in starting in June, July 45, so 6 months later, the families of the other people who perished finally found out about what happened to their sons or husbands, brothers, etc. So it's a fascinating story. And the five did, most of them wrote books or articles about their experience. But again, maybe a screenwriter is willing to take it up and go with it. So,
Chris, you could, if you want to excuse yourself now to start working on that.
I will. Yeah.
there you go.
We're good with that.
So one of the things that I found fascinating in the book that you illustrate quite well is kind of sort of the difference between naval combat and ground combat. I mean, I think it's, when you read about the battles, it's you're dealing with soldiers on the front line and they're shooting guns, and it's very, very direct. Very often when you read about naval battles, it seems kind of impersonal, but in reading your book, it's not impersonal. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the differences and of the two types of combat, and sort of the losses suffered by these ships. I mean, one of the things that I had, one of our other guests earlier had said, he'd sort of addressed this, and he said, when you talk about combat in navies, very often there aren't a lot of casualties, but when there are, it's catastrophic, right? So maybe you can kind of touch on that a bit.
Yeah, I think, of course, I'm so very fortunate not to have ever been to war or had to fight. So it's so another reason I try to put my feet in their shoes as much as I can to try to understand what they were going through as best you can when you're not being fired at. I think if we take the army and those the ground battles, North Africa on up into France, these men are often they're around their comrades, or they're some brother in arms or a real brother, and they're looking out for each other. They're doing what they can. It's blood and guts. It's dirty, nasty, wet foxholes. It's cold. It's just trees exploding around them. I mean, I can't even imagine the sounds. And I think we ought to record more of those and play them for people. So it's sort of up close and personal. And it's, you're wounded or you get hit by something and you've got to survive. You've got to crawl back to, even someone coming to pick you up as a wounded soldier, you've got to lay there. And often I say, it was hard to find the hour. I can guess they were in this battle at a certain time, but they might not have been found for days. Not today's warfare by any stretch. And then you go to the Navy, which may be the most dramatic opposite. And I think of that, especially when I'm looking at seamen, because when I told these stories, I didn't want the Medal of Honor recipients not to take a single thing from them, or generally speaking, Silver Stars, because they experienced something different, and those stories have been told or will be told. But I like to think of the seaman that is 5 decks down, or the cook. They have no idea what's going on. And they've signed up to be blind down in the galley making breakfast. And, unless what's, of course, called to battle stations, then oh my gosh, put my pots away and I've got to go take whatever position I have. But, the captain's not telling them what exactly is going on. Mm-hmm. And so, you're sitting there and you just take your battle stations. You don't know how big a threat it is, how dire a threat it is, what's happening. So I think that actually might be worse to just not know, whereas a soldier on the ground, you sort of know. Now, the thing is, when a ship goes down, it takes a lot of people with it. The second, beside the RS Maru, the 300, off the top of my head, 350 odd men who died in one incident was the casualty of the Princeton and the Birmingham. The Princeton, when it was attacked by a Japanese bomber and hit and exploded. And the ship, the Birmingham, that had come up against it to help fight the fires. The casualties there were catastrophic. Men just burned, obliterated when the debris fell on them. And there are some descriptions that the chaplain and medics provided, again, because they documented their story. Not everyone died. And so there's some very specific articles and graphic descriptions of what went on. And as one, I think it was the chaplain said, this was a case when truly the decks ran with the rivers of blood, because so many people died in one fell swoop and the decks were just awash in blood. So then I think in the air, which I'm a little closer to because of my father, and my husband was a Navy pilot, but thankfully neither of them were shot down. But in those aircraft, Masters of the Air and everything that's come out, and all of the war pictures that we see are dramatic because you can kind of sit in the cockpit and you see what's going on. But I think you can't imagine the freezing cold. And I think of not so much the pilots in the front, but in a B-17 bomber, there's two guys back there firing their machine guns out the sides. The windows are open. I mean, the doors are open. And I mean, this terrifically cold air. And, it's coming in and the shells are falling all over their feet. They said when the aircraft came back, there were just a sea of shells in the bottom of the plane. And I've had the privilege of walking through a B-17 and the tiny, tiny little place they had to stand with any, I can say safety. It's incredible how they did this and managed to keep firing, to do whatever they could to save one of the other person in the crew. Stories of them, one gentleman who his oxygen was cut and they didn't realize that. And the only oxygen bottles were at the back of the craft and they strung together. And this is in the middle of flying at 20, 30,000 feet. They're stringing together the tubes to bring oxygen to their friend who has collapsed. So again, a very different sort of story. And I think that's also, like you said earlier, how can you tell these stories without getting sort of lost in it or horrified? But I think it's the fascinating that each experience is so different from the other, even though they're doing the same thing. So.
One of our guests asks, because you're just talking about the Air Corps, did the author cover members of the Army Air Corps? And I thought maybe I could ask you. I think he was Army Air Corps. It might have been Navy. Could be wrong here. But about there was a pilot named William Albert, who was the pilot of a plane called the Red Butt. Yes, the Red Butt. Interesting illustration on the front of that plane. Yeah, and flying a reconnaissance flight off of Borneo, and his plane disappeared that day, but there's still this kind of, we're not exactly sure what happened to him. That's kind of a mystery that's kind of continued on.
Another movie, perhaps. Yes,
there's so many, and we have to make the Ghost Army movie first, then we can get to those other movies. Okay. I just want Hollywood to know the correct order is Ghost Army first, then the other movies. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, sorry. Yes. Yes, Albert's plane, he was flying. They were on a reconnaissance mission. They were supposed to fly and lost it around Borneo, go to the south, just check. They were looking for enemy traffic, naval traffic in the area, doing some reconnaissance just to report back. It wasn't to be any particularly dangerous mission. They knew they would be crossing into enemy territory. And they tracked them, or there was at least radio traffic so far to the south of Borneo, and then the plane disappeared. And it was called the Red Butt, UTT, in quotes. And on the back was the picture, it's nose art, or it's on the side, has a young woman, naturally, in a very short skirt, polka dot, as I recall, and she's bending over and to kiss or pet or whatever a dog, indescript kind of dog, but big dog. And there was nothing, no story that I found, because I did look, and I go, why, how did it be called the Redbutt, and what's the story behind this young lady and this dog? But I don't know. So that was an identifying factor, and the plane was lost. There was a missing aircrew report. They kind of knew where the last transmissions they had were. They sent out rescue operations. Planes went out to follow the route and try to find out where they were. They did not find them. And they said, okay, well, lost at sea. Well, many of the men said, well, maybe they was able to land and the natives found them and took them and kept them from the Japanese. Maybe this, maybe that. Maybe they survived somehow. Maybe they're on a deserted island. Nothing. Years later, after the war, prisoner of war camp in Borneo, I believe, on the wall were etched some names. I think there were 5 or 6 names from this crew. They spelled wrong in one case. So were they there? Was someone there who knew them and maybe misspelled their name wrong? Theoretically, that was not an uncommon thing to do. But what was uncommon was for the Japanese to allow that to be found. I mean, they missed erasing these names from the walls. But regardless, there's no record that they were actually spent time in that prisoner of war camp. So it's a mystery. And I say in the book, maybe someday a piece of polka dot skirt will be found and what happened.
So one of the other things that I think is an important contribution to the story is that you point out times when it's not due to combat or enemy action or anything, it's just an accident.
Right.
But they are casualties, and they're casualties of war. So maybe, you could highlight a story. You talk about some deaths that are suffered in the United States where you would think that you're safe. You've got a safe spot to be. Maybe there's somebody that you should remind us about.
Yeah, well, there were a number, and a lot of them were plane crashes of crews in training or about to be deployed. But I think my favorite, I had done, as I said, I thought, okay, I got 24 hours. I'll have 24 chapters, 24 hours. Now, they're not all, each chapter isn't necessarily 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, but it's what hour I found. But I had finished the book, sent it to my publisher. It was making its way. And the sad thing was, out of the 2,600 who died, there was not a single woman. And I tried. I just thought, wouldn't it be nice? It's unfortunate for the woman, but wouldn't it be nice to have a balanced story? There were 2 women who died days before the 24th, and some who died a couple of days later. In all the whole war, there were only 432 women who died, so it's slim odds. But I'm done with the book, and across my screen of the computer comes the name of the woman who died on October 24th. I don't know how it happened. So I called the publisher. I said, please stop. I'm sorry. We have to have a 25th chapter. And so we added one. And this was Margaret Neubauer, who was a young woman who's very, very talented, came from a very educated family, had gone to college, which was a rarity in those days. It's not quite explicit what she was doing. She was in the Navy, proving grounds in Bethesda, Maryland, working on something we're not quite sure what was. May have had to do with some radio equipment. But her official title, and she was in training, was Pigeoneer. And after my earlier book, when I learned that there were 500 different jobs in the Army, or Army, for example, similar in the Navy and the Air Force. In the Army, you could, rifleman, tank driver, whatever, and one was pigeoneer and one was saddle maker. And I have said, I need someday to find a pigeoneer and someday to find a saddle maker. I found the pigeoneer. Pigeoneer, we were using pigeons in World War II for communications. Not as much as we did in World War I, but we were. And so their job was to use, when we had radio silence, if the ship sent a pigeon out with a message tied to its leg and it went off, someone, when it came back to its home base, they would get the capsule and get the message and decode it. Well, that's sort of true. The women, even they might be pigeoneers, were not allowed to handle the capsules. That was a man's job. They could feed and care for the pigeons, but they couldn't they couldn't touch that sensitive information. But I didn't care. I had my pigeoneer, and Margaret was walking back to her barracks after being away at 4:30 in the morning in the dark in Bethesda, and was struck by a truck and killed. And we know exactly her time of death. She passed the next morning. So, the tragic, and I'm happy to honor her memory.
Well, Rona Simmons, your book is a primer on just how much is going on in one day in World War II. It's called No Average Day, the 24 Hours of October 24th, 1944. And I think it captures incredible variety that makes World War II endlessly fascinating here, even 80 years on. You've got a tremendous variety of locations, variety of types of death. I mean, from anything you can imagine. There's 1,000 ways to die in World War II, and you've got many of them in here. But also a variety of people, fascinating, interesting people from all walks of life who found their way into the military and who sadly passed away on this day. So it's a little bit overwhelming, but really interesting. Thank you so much for coming on here.
Absolutely, my pleasure. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. Good luck with everything.
Thank you. Well, Chris, oh my God, you've sunk down there.
I know. It's the hotel chair, man. I can go.
I can get down there too if I
All right.
need
Well,
to.
thank you.
Okay. Next week, everybody, we're going to be interviewing Matthew Goodman, who is the author of the book Paris Undercover, a story about two women in Nazi-occupied Paris who create a daring escape line that rescues dozens of Allied servicemen, but it's what happens next after that makes it most remarkable, and we'll pick up that story with Matthew next Sunday. So, yeah, so we continue. We're continuing on with World War II, continuing on with live shows. I feel like we've been live.
It's crazy.
Doing a lot of live shows. So there will come a time when the boys are on the road and where the encore episodes will take over. But
Wait a minute, I'm on the road.
Well, you're on the road in Europe where
Oh,
we can fit it in. It's when you're on
Gotcha.
the road in the US or in the Pacific
That's
where,
the
my
problem.
friend, you will be headed.
yeah, I will be. Yeah.
And that is
Whole
where it gets
6
to be a
weeks.
problem. And when we're on the road in Boston in April, we're going to miss a show. Although we probably
We're talking about trying to do
we're crossing our fingers that on April 20th, I think it is, we would do our 5th anniversary show. It's not exactly the anniversary, but close enough that we be together and maybe have maybe do something connected with the Battle of Lexington.
You'll try to bring me back from the edge.
Maybe something in a good location that is part of that. So we'll have just finished up the tour.
A wicked location, as we would.
Well, the people will take all the huge amounts of tip money that we'll undoubtedly make, and we'll pay for. No, oh, wait a minute! I'm getting a no signal. Okay.
No.
Okay, never mind. No.
Anyway.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, podcast. Back us on Patreon. If you're going to listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon.
Okay.
And browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.
Hold on. We're not off yet.